Hello there. Welcome to the Good.Enough.Shrink podcast. We are your hosts. I am Jenna Chang, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing here in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Dr. Patrick Kelly. I am also a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing in the Los Angeles area.
We are on a mission to demystify child psychiatry and have conversations surrounding difficult topics on youth and adult mental health, but not without a little play along the way. Welcome to the podcast, or welcome back if you've been here before. So this is the third part of the attachment theory series that we're talking about. And I guess just to recap from last time, we were chatting a lot about mentalization and how that's really important for connecting with people, relating with others, but more relevantly for us, parenting, being able to understand that you have a mind of your own that can then perceive an experience, and having a mind can affect that experience. And other humans, little humans, kids, they have a mind of their own that can perceive an experience. And the parents, when they have an understanding that their child is a separate mind from their own, it can really give room for empathy. So we talked about Peter Fonagy and the mentalization, and there's different steps to really mentalizing well. And I think the three key points are that you first have to regulate your emotions, because if you're freaking out, it's really hard to sit back and say, okay, this child has a mind of his or her own. And you also, in that same sentiment, mirror and validate the child's experience. So if the child is really happy and giddy and excited about a lollipop, you're happy and giddy with them. If they're upset, then you maybe sigh and you seem upset with them. And so meeting them where they're at, letting them know that their emotions are important, that you're not ignoring or dismissing or catastrophizing their emotions, will help them understand the value of their emotions and trust themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I think this can be confused with being teachable moments where parents demonstrate or instruct kids how to respond to the world. If something scary happens, you almost exaggerate what's going on to sort of instill that into the child so that they stay safe, so that they're afraid of scary situations. Or if they fall down and scrape their knee and they're crying, you want to care for them. So, oh no, this is fine. Isn't it funny? Like, look at the clown over there, and you sort of distract. But the idea of mentalization is not to necessarily change how someone responds. It's really to just reflect their response back to themselves so that they can then reflect on it themselves. So recognizing the separateness of those two individuals and then really trying to mirror as much as possible. And that's, so Peter Fonagy has mentalization-based treatment, mentalization-based therapy. And it's actually, frankly, a hard therapy for psychiatrists and therapists to learn, because it seems superficially very basic and simple. You really are just trying to reflect what's happening in the room and what the patient's putting out back to the patient, which is kind of different than how a lot of therapies work. But that really is the core of mentalization, is helping to serve as that kind of regulating mirror for someone, as opposed to trying to change what's coming out.
And instilling within them that they can rely on their sensory systems, their mind, and their interpretation, and bringing back that sense of self and really solidifying that. And the other concept that he talked about was intersubjectivity, which, along with your child having a mind of their own, there's something to sharing that experience or emotion that can really connect to individuals. And so around the time that Peter Fonagy really started to do a lot of research in this area, there was an explosion of research and publications in the neurosciences in the 1990s, which was quite an exciting time. And it's helpful to have these neurobiological, neuroscientific evidence to back what we were starting to understand about affect regulation, mirror neurons. And so we want to talk about some aspects of neuroscience, neurobiology, so that it can help make sense of what we're talking about and that it's rooted in biological underpinnings.
It's also fascinating, if I do say so, that you can really map these psychological constructs and these functional constructs to the specific types of neurons that they live in. It's so interesting. So I think seeing both sides, both how it comes out in therapy or in the world around us, and then being able to track back to the actual circuits that are doing that is really helpful to understand it. And yeah, just very interesting.
Yes. So when a baby is born, what's fascinating is that neurons are the least differentiated cells in the entire body, meaning that neurons are not fully developed. They're like baby cells. And so Peter Fonagy and Mary Target, who was another researcher at the time, they said that attachment relationships train the brain to work with social cues in a collaborative existence with others for which the brain was designed for. So if you imagine these really like baby cells that are neurons and they just have a lot to learn, and you're immersing these cells in the attachment crucible and they're swimming and learning and gaining all of this knowledge and experience. That is the idea of how the neurons develop. As we said, referring back to the previous episode, that we don't do well in isolation. We are designed to grow surrounded by people, and loneliness increases the risk of heart disease and stroke by almost 30%, about 30%, increases the risk of dementia by 50%. So it's really from the very beginning that the neurons that are undifferentiated are growing into full-blown adult neurons in the holding environment of the attachment relationships.
And it's really interesting. There are extreme examples of that, right? There are animal studies where they've raised animals in totally dark rooms during their development. And even after leaving those dark rooms, they never develop sight, even though their eyes work perfectly fine. Their brains simply never develop the ability to process that information because they never had to. So it's really responsive to what sort of experiences you have in your environment, both from a pure sensory perspective and an interaction perspective.
Yeah, it really, the early years of your life shape the trajectory of your experience quite a bit. Not to say that it can't be changed, but it's a big factor. Yeah. Dan Siegel, who is a very famous neuroscientist, researcher, over at UCLA actually now, he said in 1999 that neurons that fire together wire together. And this is why, as a parent, regulating your emotions and mirroring are so important so that you can bring the child in to model for them what is possible. Another interesting factoid is that so synapses are connections between neurons, and it's the way that neurons communicate with each other. So, for example, if a neuron up in the brain needs to tell your legs to move during a run, that synapse will help with that communication. If you're starting to feel hungry, you reach for a snack, the synapses help with that. So synapses are just a way that neurons communicate with each other. But you have the highest number of synapses in your brain around the ages 2 to 3. So the terrible twos, that age period where they're just wanting to absorb everything. Everything is interesting. Everything, you put it into your mouth a little bit just to see how it goes. So it's really robust explorative period where the synapses are abundant. Interestingly, the mind and the brain start to narrow down the number of synapses throughout your childhood into early adulthood. And around the age of 25 is when what we call synaptic pruning ends, which is that you essentially have weaved out and removed the superfluous and unnecessary, maybe distracting synaptic connections and really narrowed down to what's really important to you. And so this is the basis of forming your belief systems, values, desires, it has now consolidated for the most part around the age of 25. So in childhood, pre-adolescence, adolescence, early adulthood, a lot of the brain is still quite malleable. You can have a pretty big impact. And after that, it's expected that people have more or less solidified what's important to them.
Right. And those things, of course, like you say, can change and can be moved, but the brain and humans in general they're always seeking efficiency, right? If we had to think about every simple action we take, if we had to think about walking, all the muscles involved in that, the balance that's required to stay upright, those simple things are so complicated that your brain is always trying to be as efficient and as straightforward and as, I don't want to say simple, but to remove unnecessary complexity. So the complex discussion and ideas that go into forming your opinions about X, eventually you kind of forget that and you just remember X, whatever X is. And so changing X to Y, you have to sort of work backwards and rediscover all of that logic that you had to begin with and then sort of move over to Y. So it's more complicated, but it's not impossible. The idea is not that you're fixed at the age of 25, but that it's harder to question things after that, and that a lot of your assumptions are put into place. And actually, interestingly, a lot of therapy, CBT in particular, is all about uncovering underlying assumptions and exposing them and trying to open up some of that space and some of those questions again and some of that discovery to recomplexify some held ideas. So this is an example of where we can see the biological underpinnings of therapy and how it works. I find this stuff so interesting.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think we often hear people that go through therapy say, well, I learned the skills. I learned about reframe and black and white thinking. And I know that I do these things and I know how to manage them, but it still happens and it still comes back. And I think that's sort of the point that you're making, Dr. Kelly, is that because our brains would rather keep it more or less simple, that sometimes things get pushed into the background and they are not processed. And so as we bring them forward, you realize that has a pretty big impact on you. And that's part of therapy too, is not just learning skills, although those are very, very important, but you're constantly asking yourself, what is something that's unconscious or maybe something that I'm not aware of that is really affecting the way I feel and experience my life?
Mhm.
So, and to jump off of that, in terms of understanding the brain, what's really important is that we have tiers of function in the brain. And in the 90s, there was this idea of the triune, I'm saying that right, triune brain. And it starts with more primitive functions of autonomic nervous system and basic breathing and moving and eating. And that part of the brain is at the bottom. And then the next level up is all about your emotions. And we call that the limbic system. And then the final level up, which is kind of the last to develop in the brain, and it's the most complicated, is the neocortex, which works on the executive functioning, high complex thoughts. So the lowest level is really essentially the brainstem. The brainstem is actually already active in the womb, which I did not really realize that this is fully operational. So if the baby is kicking and moving and receiving nutrients, the brainstem helps with that. It modulates the autonomic nervous system. So this is either your fight or flight sympathetic system or rest and digest parasympathetic system. And there's actually a lot of research on the polyvagal theory and how to use that parasympathetic system. But interestingly, babies smiling at 2 months, so that's kind of the milestone for a social smile, is inevitably a reflex because at that point, your brainstem is really the only thing that's like fully developed. And so this means that social smile is biological. It's something we have pre-birth and we strive for from the very beginning. So that's the lowest level of primitive functioning. And then you get to the limbic system. And there's two structures here that I think are important to talk about. The first one is the amygdala. I think we can have a whole episode on the amygdala.
Yeah.
But the amygdala essentially assesses threat and it acts within milliseconds. It's also fairly well developed at birth, not quite as much as the brainstem, but it registered emotional memories. So these are pre-verbal because obviously babies can't really, they can't really talk that well, but it registers emotional memories, meaning if baby was scared or happy or upset, angry, whatever it is, those memories stay. And this is to the point of you always remember how you felt talking to a person or being in a situation, but you don't really remember what they said or what was happening. So the emotional memories are quite rudimentary in that it's in a lower mid level of the brain where it registers pretty reflexively. So then the other structure that's really important is the hippocampus. So hippocampus is kind of an authoritative figure where amygdala is, instantaneous and it assesses threat in an explosive way. And the hippocampus puts a brake on it. This interestingly, the hippocampus does not come online fully until around 2 to 3 years old. So for the first couple of years of your life, you are functioning on the brainstem and the amygdala. So you can eat and sleep and do all of these bodily functions, and you are either feeling threatened or not threatened. So it's quite a contrasting experience until the hippocampus comes online and says, okay, there are nuances. There's gray between the black and the white, and we can start to learn those nuances. So acute relational trauma, meaning a falling out with a caretaker or some sort of severance in that attachment relationship, can actually shut down the hippocampus or inhibit its development. So you can imagine what that might do for the child in regards to trauma and potentially developing PTSD is that you have no regulation of that amygdala. It is out of control, indiscriminate, and the smallest threat, smallest discomfort can be perceived as a full-on threat. This also is important if you think about emotional memories. So, at that age, you're not really having too many words to describe what's happening, but you do have pretty clear memories of the emotions that you have. And so when you let's say have fear, you experience fear because maybe your father has left, that can shut down, that fear itself can shut down the hippocampus or inhibit its development. And the child sort of stays in that point of development and they're not able to emotionally develop further. However, patients who can retrieve these old emotional memories in therapy or in a new attachment relationship that's safe and understanding can then forge new associations in the brain and the mind and heal from that.
And that brings up so many thoughts because all of this, everything you've talked about, is fundamentally independent of higher order thinking or language. It's all to an extent automatic that develops slowly, right? The brainstem keeps you alive. The amygdala keeps you alive in a different way by scanning for threat. And the hippocampus adds sort of nuance and color to what is truly threatening, what is not threatening, how to respond to things. But none of these are conscious. None of these are things we can access and think about. So the idea of having a trauma or something disruptive or something that's stored sort of down at that level and then going into a therapist and talking through it is very complicated. And that's why I've heard certainly people frustrated by therapy. Why can't the therapist just tell me what's going on? Or why can't I just say what's happening? Why am I surprised by what comes up in therapy? It's because these things are not conscious. They're not cognitive. They're not at that level. And you can see this happen to people if God forbid, they've been through a big traumatic event. When a trigger comes up, they go straight back to that amygdala, they go straight back to that brainstem, and the body just takes over to survive, to do whatever it needs to do, even if later it might be something that someone regrets. And very interestingly, the person themselves often can't explain why they're reacting that way because it's so deep. It just happens. It's independent of that. So using the tools we have, using language to get there takes time and has to be done in sort of a slow, careful way to really gain access to that. And I think that's one of the complications of therapy that's built into your biology. And one of the reasons why it's an intricate and longer term process. It's not just sort of a one time analysis and, well, here's what's going on with you. Good luck. Now that you understand it, everything will be fine.
Yeah, and I think that's why we do a lot of mindfulness, grounding, breathing techniques, because it is really about bringing it back to the body. I think actually Freud said the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. So it really, it's funny, I'm quoting Freud at this point. But when it is very much based in that sort of inherent biological function, you do have to bring it back to that level and reactivate your sensory system, the bodily system. And just to transition into exactly what you're saying, Dr. Kelly, about things being in that cognitive realm, that's when the neocortex comes in. And this is the last to develop in the brain. And so it's the most advanced part of the brain. And if you are anyone in psychiatry, psychology, or any sort of neurosciences, you do have to have a pretty good understanding of the prefrontal cortex, which is essentially the executive function of the brain. And there's two parts that I think are worth highlighting. And these are going to be mouthfuls. So if you have never heard of these terms, don't worry. It's just something we professionals just have to memorize. So the prefrontal cortex is essentially, they have two parts. One is, I would say, logic, like just purely straight up logic. And this is operated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is about cognitive control, reason. And the other side is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This part of the prefrontal cortex assesses more emotionally and socially appropriate stimuli. It looks at reward and value, and it actually modulates where the attention would go. So it's they kind of call it like the socially logical or the emotionally logical side of the prefrontal cortex. If I had to bring up an example, it's sort of like sometimes you just instinctively know. Maybe you meet someone and you just sort of know that there might not be the best intentions, but you can't quite put words to it because they check out everything on their resume or whatever it is. But you just kind of feel like there's something off. And that's the ventral medial prefrontal cortex working, that there's some social cues, emotional cues that you're not quite able to verbalize that tells you, this might not make sense.
Isn't that
So
amazing that we know where intuition lives in that way in the brain? We can map it. It's fascinating.
fascinating. Um, Three other places I think that are worth mentioning. One is called the orbital frontal cortex. This is actually kind of like the senior executive in the prefrontal cortex world. The orbital frontal cortex contextualizes threat and figures out the degree of the threat. And it gauges the impact of that threat on your surroundings. And it's really related to the self-regulation system and the ability to relate to others. Then we have the anterior cingulate. The anterior cingulate still has a lot of research that's ongoing, and I think people are still trying to figure it out. But it seems like this is sort of the closest thing to represent attachment, affect regulation, and mentalization, because it's involved in both the conscious experience of an emotion and also the way that you experience connectedness with another person. And there's a lot of implications in maternal behavior and the ways that oxytocin, which is a hormone that gets released in abundance after giving birth in the mother, there's a lot of links to the effects of oxytocin here. So anterior cingulate, if you hear that, it's another structure that has a lot to do with attachment. And lastly, the insula. So the insula is really interesting because when I was trying to memorize these things in medical school, I just remember that it had a lot to do with disgust. This feeling of like something is disgusting, not only physically, like you smell something or you see something and it's like, ugh, but also morally, intellectually, ethically. If it seems just wrong, the insula activates. And so they believe that it relays sensory motor information from the cortex. So the sensory system feeds into the cortex and it relays that to the amygdala. The amygdala, as we know, is this sort of like threat assessment center. And then it relays that information back to the cortex. And so the insula is kind of somewhere in between there. But it's quite interesting because in my mind, when I thought about the limbic system or the neocortex and the executive control system, there is a lot of ways that the brain protects us from negative stimuli. So if it's a threat, maybe something poisonous, whatever it is, the way that our brain works is so protective against negative stimuli.
And it can go into overdrive sometimes, right? A lot of trauma, a lot of PTSD is your brain trying to keep you safe in ways that don't serve you, in maladaptive ways. But it's a biological function of your brain. You know, if people are disgusted by dead bodies, one of the reasons for that may be that they could have illness or they could be contaminated with something that would get you sick. So it's your brain actually trying to drive you intuitively away from things that could hurt you or that could make you sick. So it's a survival mechanism that's really complicated and can maybe get turned to the left sometimes by different life experiences that need to be recorrected. But yeah, being able to map that, being able to point on a diagram as to where that lives, where that happens, super interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these brain areas interact to tell us how to sense threat, discern whether the threat is real, and regulate our emotions and physiological reactions in response to that. And then that brings up the question of how do we really know we're alive? This is kind of along the lines of consciousness, but really, how do we know that we're really existing in this world? And that goes back to the body. A lot of times with a brain like that, that can be very productive and explosive in a way, it can be really confusing what's real and what's not. And I think that happens with trauma. Like even the smallest threat can feel like all consuming. And so the self-sensing system is everything related to the body and the brain. This was proposed by Dr. van der Kolk in 2014 in the very famous Body Keeps the Score book. He actually talked about in chronic PTSD patients, especially with severe early life trauma, there is almost no activation in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and the insula. So these parts of the brain shut down. And if you imagine, these are kind of more regulatory areas that foster, whether it's mentalization, empathy, understanding, or discernment, these areas are offline. And in order to cope, then these traumatized people, they shut these areas down because it's just too much. If you have to constantly judge whether something is safe or not safe, it's just too much. And so they then transmit these bodily feelings and emotions that accompany terror into their bodies. So a lot of things are kept in the body. This is also related to attachment in a way that I'll go into a little bit later. But essentially, you either keep it all in the body or you're totally disconnected and you don't understand what your body is going through.
The body keeps the score. There are two sides to that. You're exactly right. That your brain is your body. We're talking about the physical structures of the brain as well as the body outside of the brain. There's the idea of the subcortical areas like the amygdala, like the hippocampus, that are structurally altered through trauma. We can see it on functional MRIs. And then there's the physical responses that people have outside of the brain, how their body feels or not being able to feel their body that is also regulated by the same thing. So it's the idea that there are organic changes to experiences, to experiential trauma.
Hmm. Yeah. And how do we then get back in touch with our bodies and connect with it better? And that's, as we mentioned earlier, we do these techniques, whether it's grounding or breathing or getting a massage or just physical touch with getting a hug. Those kinds of things can bring us back to our sensing system, our self-sensing system, and ground us. Um, Knowing what we feel is the first step to understanding why we feel them. We have to put words to what we feel. This is why I think it's so important to identify those emotions that we feel, because you don't understand what you cannot speak of. So if you start to feel something, you're interacting with someone, let's say you got a rejection email from a job that you're hoping to get, you start to have that discomfort in your chest and maybe in your stomach and these emotions that you can't really put words to. We in therapy encourage, first of all, what are you feeling in your body? Oh, it's really tense in my chest. I can't breathe. Oh, my stomach feels like it's flipping. Okay. And so that's your bodily sensations. And what emotions are you having? And oftentimes I think it's almost impossible to come up with emotions other than like upset, angry, kind of simplistic, purified forms of emotions. But as we talk more and more in therapy, you can come up with a narrative of emotions. And that can be incredibly healing because now suddenly you have a story to tell. And when you have a story to tell, you have an understanding of yourself and who you are.
And a lot of
So,
people, not not in a negative way, I think in an intuitive way, don't want to do this. Do not like this part of therapy because we're essentially saying, okay, something bad, uncomfortable, whatever word you want to use, is happening to you physically. Now think about it and tell me about it. Go deeper into it. When I think the instinct is to run away from it. And there are lots of sayings in therapy that we'll throw out, but one is, what you resist persists. So running away from feelings like that, it can bring relief in the moment, but one, it's going to come back. You haven't done anything to change it. And
mhm.
two, whatever you want to run away from becomes bigger and scarier the more you run away from it. And so actually taking the time in the right setting, in the right situation with the right person to really go into and describe and talk about what those physical sensations, emotional sensations, feelings are really gives you a lot of power over them. And it can feel like it's going to make it worse. Or once you identify it, it's never going to go away, that ignoring it is the best way to go. But actually getting more in touch with it is part of the cure. It's part of what makes it better because it gives a sense of control. It reduces sort of the meta worries about what's actually happening. So it can be a somewhat uncomfortable initial experience when people are thinking about therapy or going through therapy, but it's really helpful in moving everything forward and moving your understanding forward and moving any change you want to make forward in really sort of digging into where this came from in the first place.
Hmm. And I think what you mentioned about taking back the control, it's really closely related to that ability to trust ourselves, that we see ourselves as separate entities with feelings, thoughts, and beliefs that are different from others. And that is okay. That works. And this gets back to the mentalization capabilities as a parent. So let's say, for example, if your baby is crying and there's not enough milk, you feel awful about not being able to breastfeed or for whatever reason, and you are attuned as a parent to the baby's physical needs, that you reflect that emotion and essentially tells them that their inner sensations matter, that you can trust those sensations because they're important. At the same time, they can be their own humans and they will not become your idea of a baby, but they are their own personhood. So this prevents the self-sensing system from shutting down in that child. You actually learn to embrace it and trust it and build confidence surrounding it. and eventually develop a full sense of self. So all of this comes together, everything we've talked about, to get back to how can we build our children's self-esteem, sense of self as much as possible. And it really starts with understanding what's happening in your body, being able to articulate how that feeds into your emotion, and being okay with it. The other drastically revolutionary research that came up in the mid 1990s was the idea of mirror neurons. So in the mid 1990s, this Italian neuroscientist, his name was Rizzolatti. He discovered that in the premotor cortex of monkeys, there's a group of neurons that fire together doing a movement and watching other monkeys do that same movement. And this also occurred in humans. What's really interesting about this is that it only occurred with intentional action. So it wasn't necessarily the motion of it, but that the monkeys could feel that there was an intention to make that movement. And that was enough to fire these neurons together. And so it suggested that these neurons fired in response to underlying mental states rather than just the motion of the movement. This relates to the idea of empathy, attunement, affect attunement, and mentalization. And so we just started to have all these evidences that really supported what we were seeing in the qualitative research world and observations. And so with mirror neurons, we realize how important sharing feelings and intentions and attention with another was. Knowing that you have your own subjective experience, but also being able to share that with another is incredibly powerful. Actually, they found out that at 42 minutes of age, so within 42 minutes of birth, infants can imitate facial expressions of adults. And so again, mirror neurons are hardwired. At 6 weeks, they can actually imitate gestures automatically. All this is to say, hey, I'm like you. I want you to see that I'm like you. I want to connect with you. Daniel Stern in 1985 found that babies turn to their primary caregivers to find out what they're feeling. If you're a parent, you probably can feel this all the time. If they see something and they are not sure what they're supposed to feel, the baby will just look at you to assess what's going on your face. And what is shared is accepted, and what is not is shut out. So in early infancy, that's kind of a general rule from which infants try to make sense of the world, is that when something is understood and accepted and shared, then it's fine to keep. But if something is shut out, then it's not okay to keep that in your mind. This is how you build a subjective experience. And two minds that create intersubjectivity, so between, let's say, the child and the parent, they feed off of each other, and so it's not just that the child is receiving a lot of information from the parent and that's it. The adult can also receive a lot of that information and shape their own experience interacting with the child.
And this happens outside of, maternal fetal dyads as well. This is how communities are formed, that people respond to each other and mirror each other, and what is a shared experience, what is a shared understanding persists, and what is sort of idiosyncratic or isolated to one member may be less accepted. So it's one of the theories as to how some people develop unusual, isolated, idiosyncratic ideas, because essentially everything's shut out. So if a parent is not responding, if a parent's not there, and basically everything that's thrown out gets shut down, they're really on their own to create their own isolated community of one. And so it's difficult to find others with whom they can coexist when their brain is wired, literally, as we're seeing, to seek those shared experiences and those shared attentions. So one of Peter Fonagy's ideas of mentalizing trauma, or failures of mentalization, are that somebody not only doesn't know how to respond to given stimuli, but responds in a unusual, idiosyncratic, isolated way that they themselves don't understand because they're taught sort of not to look at it or not to share it or that it shouldn't be shared. And so it's kind of a difficult experience. It's remediable, but it's one of the reasons that some people say that personality disorders can emerge, that somebody doesn't have that sense of belonging in a community. They never developed that. They never developed shared experiences. And so, fine, they're just going to do whatever they do by themselves. And they don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it because they're taught not to seek that sort of shared understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the idea of belonging comes to mind where you feel like you don't belong or you're not accepted or received for who you are. Of course, you shut that part out because you have to survive. Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, the intersubjectivity, because let's say, if you have attachment without intersubjectivity, so you feel that there is a bond, however, you're not sharing as well emotions, experiences, then you might think about a person with autism and their experience. You are able to have attachment and bond, but you're not having intersubjectivity. On the flip side, if you have intersubjectivity without attachment, so you feel that you share a lot of things and it's very emotionally satisfying. However, there isn't this bond that's secure and safe, feeling like they would accept both your flaws and strengths. If there's no attachment, but there's intersubjectivity, you think of love at first sight, someone that you just instantly, some sort of soulmates, but you don't know them. You don't really know them. So that's the different polarities of that experience, that you need both.
And in child language, this is not, it's not a term that's used that much anymore, but this would have been called reactive attachment disorder, right? Either disinhibited type or with a social impairment. You're either a community of one, you're totally isolated, you can't trust anyone else, you don't share anything, there's no sort of intersubjectivity with any other beings on Earth, even though you can have a superficial attachment to them. Or everyone you meet is your potential mom, dad, soulmate, whatever it is, with no sort of functional or time established attachment to them.
Yes, and I actually wonder what you think about the DSM in this area, Dr. Kelly, because I do think reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, they parallel these different types of attachment styles, both rooted in insecure attachment, but one being very, very avoidant and isolative. That's more rad. And then the other being more sort of fawning and overly seeking connection in the DSED. Yeah, I just wonder sort of what you think about that categorization and how in the DSM they don't really talk about attachment that much. What are your thoughts?
Well, lots of thoughts. We could have another episode on the DSM and its successes and failures and what it's really for. I mean, the DSM was developed to be a research manual, right? It's developed to categorize things that statistically hang together and that are studyable and to make it easier for us to describe them. So fundamentally, they're all human imposed concepts on phenomena that we see, right? If someone has a broken arm, you can take an x-ray of it and you can see it. Oh, the arm's broken. If someone has even major depressive disorder, which is I think 100% established condition, even that is based on symptoms and time lapse and how many days it's lasted for and which of the 9 symptoms you have. And then you meet criteria or you don't. So it's the DSM, it's the best we have in terms of diagnosing people, but it's still an artificial construct and a collection of artificial constructs. And I wouldn't be surprised if the DSM-6 changes things all over again about how we categorize things. So I think the ideas of attachment and how that drives things are even harder to categorize. And there's so much, because it happens when you're so young, trying to evaluate that in an evidence-based way to include or not include people in research studies is so complicated. I just think that's a different goal than the DSM has, maybe. So I think thinking of the DSM as sort of the Bible of psychiatry is not exactly correct. It's a categorization of some of the major diagnoses that we have, but it also is more cross-sectional. Even major depressive disorder itself doesn't talk about where the major depressive disorder comes from, right? It doesn't as much talk about etiology for everything. It's more, have you had 5 symptoms of the 9 for more than 2 weeks that are impairing, regardless of where it comes from or what happened. So really the diagnostic formulation and looking at somebody through a broader lens and seeing where all of this is coming from in the first place, I think is the more important piece. It's hard because concepts that we feel are very important, like what culture you grew up in, like attachment theory, like experiences that you've had in the past, really aren't even discussed in the DSM. So I think the DSM has a narrower focus is my answer to that question.
Yes, that loaded question. Thank you
Yeah.
for taking the time and answering that. Yeah. No, I think you're totally on point with everything you said. It's a collection of symptoms to help guide us in treatment and research, but it doesn't address etiology. It doesn't address where things come from. My hope is that they can start to address some of that, whether in the DSM or not, but I think in psychiatry as a field, psychology as a field, that attachment disruption, attachment trauma is a core cause. And so when you understand that there is an etiological basis to mental health conditions from an attachment perspective, then you can really approach treatment in a way that's effective. And so tying this back to the body, the way that we heal from trauma or anxiety or depression or any sort of mood issues, even things like autism, ADHD, where, there's neurodivergence and there's being misunderstood, being rejected, that kind of feeling. If you have the ability to create an intersubjective experience that relies on your ability to accept the emotional signals and the bodily signals that you receive from your body to the brain to your mind, then you can achieve the embodied mind. And that embodied mind is really that balance between everything physiological, everything kind of psychological, emotional, and creating and respecting all of those different aspects of you. Like all the different parts of you are coming to the table and you're respecting that. And the way to integrate, again, all of that and reach for that embodied mind is through mindfulness. And this is not just kind of sitting, in a yoga studio with an incense and being quiet and being still. But I think of mindfulness as more anything that totally consumes you. Sometimes people will draw, sometimes people will knit, maybe they are playing sports. Anytime that you're totally consumed in that activity and you can tune out the rest of the world, it gives space for your body and your brain and your mind to be in its natural state.
And it's not always instinctual, especially for someone who leans very heavily one way or another. I think mindfulness is a skill. It's something that you can learn and practice. That's why people call it a mindfulness practice. It's, like riding a bicycle. It's not intuitive at first. You have to figure it out where your feet go and sort of how to pedal and how fast to pedal. And I think mindfulness is the same way. And I do sometimes think that there's maybe a misunderstanding or a mythos around mindfulness that if you're not mindful right away, you're failing, or that mindfulness is something that everyone should have or is easy. And it's not for everyone, but it is achievable. And it's something that is a practice. And there's an old saying in mindfulness meditation that whatever you get out of the mindfulness meditation session that you have is exactly what you were supposed to get at the time. And I think that frees up a little bit of the, for some people, perfectionism or resistance to engaging in that mindfulness. That, every step forward is exactly that. It's a step forward. You're not supposed to be perfect the first time you do it.